Okay, we're starting chapter 3, and this is somewhat of a carryover from chapter 2. So, let's talk about metals, which we've already talked a little bit about already, and some characteristics are they are shiny, they conduct electricity and heat very well. We can say that they are opaque, O-P-A-Q-U-E, which means light doesn't shine through them very well. And 4, we can say they are malleable, which means we can strike it and bend it into any type of position that we want. Now, these are just some basic characteristics, but when we look at the periodic table, and we talk about the location, we can see here that this area of red that's highlighted and this is a slight variation from your textbook, but this area of red are all considered to be metals, this entire area of red. So you should be able to look at the periodic table and identify what is a metal just by looking at the periodic table. And in your textbook there is a similar drawing that identifies the metals versus the nonmetals and metalloids, which we'll talk about in a second. So let me erase this. Okay, so the second thing we should be familiar with are the nonmetals. What are the nonmetals? Well, let's first talk about some characteristics of the nonmetals. Well, the metals were shiny, so for the most part, nonmetals are dull. Also, we can say nonmetals are solid, liquids, and gases, as opposed to the metals that were just mainly solid for the most part. And these nonmetals do not conduct heat or electricity, or they are poor conductors of heat and electricity. And whereas a metal was malleable, If you hit or strike a non-metal, it's usually going to break, and we can say a non-metal is brittle. Okay? So, in reference to the periodic table, so where are the non-metals? Well, in reference to the periodic table, even though hydrogen is to the left on the periodic table, it is a non-metal. Okay? If we come along and circle this area blue, and from the last chapter we talked about the noble gases and the halogens and so on, we can see all of these elements here: carbon, nitrogen, silicon, chlorine, bromine, argon, and so on. These are considered our nonmetals. And we have one more area to discuss. And that area would be what we call the metalloids. And sometimes these are tagged as semimetals. I don't think it's written that way in your textbook, but sometimes they're given this distinction because they have properties of metals and non-metals. Okay? Now, where are the metalloids on the periodic table? So, this yellow region here along the staircase primarily: boron, silicon, germanium, arsenic, antimony, tellurium. These are what we consider our metalloids. If you notice here, these two elements are also along the staircase, and some textbooks consider these to be metalloids as well. But for the purpose of this class, I want you to distinctly remember these 6 elements as your metalloids. And one comment: aluminum is not a metalloid. Aluminum is a metal. Okay? Aluminum is a metal. So when we start talking about ionic compounds, we need to be familiar with what's a metal and what's a nonmetal. Some students get confused about nonmetals and metals, so I wanted to take this opportunity to point out where they are on the periodic table, and that way you can at least get familiar with their location without even talking about a particular charge, which is what we will do later. But be familiar with this area of blue as being your nonmetals, this area of yellow being your metalloids, and this whole lot from your alkali metals all the way through your transition metals and your lanthanide series at the bottom. Be familiar with those as your metals.